welcome to this afternoon session with Jihan, El-Tahri and John Akomfrah, and my colleague this afternoon, Palesa Shongwe, who's going to chair it. I was just saying, as you heard, that I don't think there's any need for long introductions apart from saying that both John and Jihan have worked with archives in many different ways over a number of years. And what we've asked them to do this afternoon is not to do presentations as such, but to engage in a discussion come dialogue conversation with myself and Palesa, but with each other as well. And we have the facility for people putting comments in the YouTube comment section and asking questions. And we've asked people just to keep those to questions rather. Yes, because the panelists won't see comments. Yes, so we welcome those sorts of questions, and there'll be points where they'll be passed on to us to share with John and Jihan. So what we did want to do, is just to start things by asking Jihan and John about talking about the significances and challenges. I suppose we posed three sort of headings, and it's worth saying that at the start, and then we can freeform around it. The significance and challenges of working with the archive. Yes, their own uses of the archive, yes, and how it's integrated into their work. And thirdly, the colonial archive, yes. And those are the three headings. And obviously we're open to other suggestions from people in the comments. And Palesa and I will obviously interject every so often. So maybe we should begin with Jihan. Yes.
Yes. Thank you for having me. The significance and challenges are so many. I think maybe I'd best start by saying that my own practice, I can divide in kind of three phases. I'm just about starting the fourth, but when I started working with the archive in, let's say, the mid-80s, it was more about archaeology, finding archive. And one got so excited about finding a new image that one had never seen, and you kind of built around it and tried to figure out, and so it was really about finding stuff. And then a couple of years later, you start looking at it and saying, hold on a minute, what actually is this bit of archive? So the second phase became a phase of contextualization. Whenever I find a piece of archive, it would take me more time trying to figure out, what is this piece of archive? When exactly was it? Who were in it? Why was it taken? And, that in itself became a whole different process. And then the third phase, which is the more recent one, is trying to figure out the representation of the archive, which again is a different aspect of it. Well, celluloid at the time, you don't just go and shoot. Somebody sent you out to shoot this specific event. Why was it important? Who sent you out to Of course, I'm talking about archive that is pre-digital. And so trying to figure out what lies in the image and the intention of why that image has been kept has been the last phase. So I guess if you put all these three together, on the one hand, the significance of it is that, let's be honest, we need to piece together our history. We don't know what happened. So every bit of information is one's attempt to try and grapple with these unitary mythologies that most of the time don't make sense. So these bits of archives are like little marks on the road saying, well, maybe this happened, maybe that happened. And of course, what is interesting at that point is the silent spaces. Like you find this bit of archive and you find this other bit of archive, and everything in between is missing. So I guess I'm more phase 4 is trying to figure out what is missing in the archive. contextualizing or representing. So maybe I don't know, I'm making my own life difficult, but I don't know. Go on, John, your turn.
That's a fantastic. I love the, the phrase you just used, unitary mythologies. I think that's so suggestive and so emblematic, really, of the manifold reasons why I got involved working with the archive. I mean, of course, when we say archive in this particular context, we're talking about the cinematic archive, but my engagement started with the much broader sense of what constitutes the archival, of which the cinematic was a strand. And one of the reasons why that was the case is completely tied up with who I am, in a way. I'm part of a generation of children who were either born or brought here somewhere between 1951 and 61. That generation effectively was the first post-war, post-migrant group of young people of color to experience, British society as young people, as children. Generations before had arrived, in effect, fully formed, adults, if you will. We were the first group to grow up here. And so many of the manifold contradictions and complexities of becoming in this space were revealed to us because we were in unfamiliar territories to ones that our parents would have been in. And the question of the unitary mythology was absolutely central, because one of the things you had to get used to was this discrepancy between the official rhetoric of national identity and the actually existing identities on the ground, right? You had to get used to this sense that the sense of unitariness that the official rhetoric offered was in fact a mythology. It was a necessary mythology, but it was a mythology all the same. And the reasons why you knew it was a mythology was because it seemed to both acknowledge your existence, but take it away at the same time. So it seemed to offer the idea that you were both British, but not at the same time, So one of the things that we found ourselves confronted by was the yearning and a desire to confirm, if you will, what our presence amounted to in this place. And the archival was our deconstructive turn. The archival was the means by which one secured a sense of a presence in this place, in the absence of any other tangible evidence. Otherwise, the archival functioned for us in a way that I think it does for all diasporas. Most diasporas come into being in a kind of absence, in a state of absence. There are the things that affirm other identities, be they monuments or statues, seem to indelibly not include you, right? There are not many, I mean, even now, if you look around this place, there are not many monuments that attest to the fact that between 49 and the present, millions of people from across the global south pass through this place. None. So the archive becomes this place of deposits, affective, narrative, semiotic. It's the place where you find visions of oneself. And so it has been absolutely critical for my practice because of those broader reasons. You know, there's specific ones, but those are the broader ones that have sort of animated the practice, if you like. You know.
I mean, it's interesting you say that, because I come to the archive from the complete opposite way. I grew up all over the place.
Yeah.
And the concept of being a global citizen, when one could say words like this, no more. But I didn't think it necessary to look for the me, because me was all over the place. But there was this idea that independence had a vision for a collective future. And that was passed on to me very powerfully. And the idea, this Pan-African idea, even if at a time it works, it doesn't work, it was about a process, it was about a vision, it was about a collective. And when we came back to Egypt, I grew up in the UK, when we came back to Egypt, that discrepancy between what I had grown up believing once we get back to was so contradictory that I tried to figure out, where did this vision go? How did it go? And especially, I mean, Nasser, Nkrumah, Sekaturi, the pillars of... and what happened to it? Why didn't it move? I mean, did it move forward? Did it not move forward? There was this sudden halt. It's as though something never happened. And there was no end to it. There was just like around 66, 67, everything stopped. But, you know, maybe out of, in Ghana because Nkrumah was ousted, but in Egypt because of the 67 war, but then you find it all over the place. So you come into the 70s, which is when I get back to Egypt, and it's a whole other different world. And you suddenly try and grapple with, where do I begin the new narrative? It's not as though I was against the new narrative, but, you know, where do I begin it? What happened for us to change that one? And I think that's how I come to the archive, trying to figure out first, how did they come up with that vision? And why did they come up to that, with that vision? And it's putting together all these moments of independence and what broke down and why it broke down. That was my search. And when I say about archaeology, I was trying to find these bits. So obviously, every now and then you come across things in the archives, and as John said, that depository suddenly gives you another image, and you say, hold on a minute, what was that? And I think, of course, it's related to identity. And of course, it's about, I think, the ultimate question that our generation asked, and I think this generation today is going to ask even more. Who are we? Who are we as individual countries? And who are we as a collective? And are we a collective? So it's not really about affirming this or that. I think, at least in my practice, I'm more interested in the questions that nobody's asking, as simple as, who's an Egyptian? Like, who is an Egyptian? Not who has the right to a piece of paper, but like we talk about Egyptians as they're this one thing, and again, coming back to this unitary mythologies. But, you know, the nation state as a problematic.
You know, it's so weird. Sorry to butt in. I know you, Pervaiz, and you know, you might want to say something, but I couldn't let that go. I couldn't let that moment go without pointing out the striking parallel and difference in our lives, because literally, as Jihan is heading to Africa, I was leaving. You know, I was leaving because of the 66 coup that she talks about. And in a way, what that meant for me was leaving a certain Pan-African archive to embrace a new one. Because my whole family, tradition, history was wrapped up with the Pan-African archive. You know, becoming familiar with it, learning about it, reading about it, trying to meet, you know, my dad and mom, both of them spent their whole lives up until that point trying to be good Pan-Africanists, you know, studying it, reading about it, meeting others, and you know, their whole life. And so in a way, 66 was a sort, for me, a cessation of that archive and its effectivity and its determining role in my life, you know. And I was cast into a space of another kind of solitude, in which the question of who you were post that collapse was the central one. You know, I mean, it was not unusual to hear. It's almost like a kind of threnody or a motif, musical and otherwise, in British life at the time when we arrived. It wasn't unusual to hear over and over again this question, or this idea rather, that young people of color didn't know who they were or what they were. And in fact, we made the first piece I worked on in '82, using the Albert Memorial that I've just returned to behind me again for, so your life does tend to go round and round, was about this question. And so part of the quest, I think, in generational terms, but certainly for the group that I worked with between '82 and the mid-90s, was to try and answer that question via the detour through the archive. So, okay, what are we? Because everybody tells us we are nothing. Everybody says you're nothing. And you know, I don't want to make it seem like the archive was this prismatic, pure space either. Okay, like when in '84 we wanted to make this, build this history of Black Britishness on film, not one of the official libraries in this country had a section called Black Lives or Black British. It didn't exist, right? So part of the deconstructive gesture of turning to the archive was to build precisely that inventory. You know, to go to Granada TV and say, you know, do you know what, guys? You've got this guy, Stokely Carmichael, on your list. He should be with this lot, which is called Black Panthers. Take him out of the race riots because he's not in, you know, like you had to literally provide narratives, sometimes for whole institutions, by which they can then begin to gather stuff together, you know.
The indexing, the power of the indexing.
You know? But it was, as anyone will attest who's ever confronted or encountered the archive, it is quite literally decentered. You know, it's dispersed. It's characterized by a discursivity, you know, that one of the main chapters of one's work with it is precisely to do with this question of relocating the remains, trying to literally give it body, right? Give it identity, give it shape. So it's important that we get that sense of our encounter with the archive right. It's not something that already, certainly in our case, was always already there. Right? The always alreadiness had to be put into it by us.
Yeah.
You know?
But
Sorry, can I add something to what John said? Because in my hometown, which John knows pretty well, Birmingham, up till the 90s, and I think they've relabeled them, when you went in to look for press cuttings, I was working on an exhibition, and I went to look for press cuttings, and there, the press cuttings from the 40s and 50s had the title, The Colour Problem. Yes. That was the heading of all the books. The original cuttings were all there, but it was the colour problem. That's what it was put under. Yeah. So just to give a sense of that, what we were categorized into.
But, I mean, if you don't mind, Palesa, I hope I'm not interrupting. But
no, you're okay. Please continue.
Just in terms of even on an individual country level, like I found out, like literally found out that Egypt had a president before Gamal Abdel Nasser when I'm like a full adult, only, I don't know, 15 years ago. Like, and talking about indexing and just trying to figure out. And the only reason I found out who he was is like this face kept coming in some of the archive, and I took a picture of it and I showed it to my dad, and I was like, who is this man? He keeps coming up in the archive, and I can't find a name for him. And he says, oh, that was Egypt's first president. I said, what do you mean Egypt's first president? It's like, wasn't it Nasser? He said, no, there was a president for almost 3 years before. 3 years. And I didn't even know his name. I couldn't recognize his face. And so when I said the indexing, it's like when people teams are white, even the way we tell history, if I didn't have my dad to tell me who this man was, there's my whole narrative and how I'm putting it together and how trying to arrange, trying to log, I mean, loggings is a completely different time. In the archive in the Congo, logging the archive for them, just because I needed to understand one little bit. The archive was there. I mean, half the time you opened the canister and the termites flew in your face. But the logging itself didn't indicate, I mean, some of it wasn't there. But to do this was, at least I believe, more important for my film than to actually use the images I found. Because in these 3 months, by logging the archive, a whole narrative that there was no way I was going to put it in any film, but it gave me an understanding of at least what not to say.
You, Jihan, I recently read an interview that you did with Pervaiz, in which you speak about the tension between what you call sort of I think you've both referred to it, John, as well, this notion of the official rhetoric and what does get recorded and what ends up being kind of on the surface when we talk about history and we talk about archive, and then the undiscovered, the underground, the kind of the stuff that happens that is missed or repressed, or and what you're both causing me to think about is, as well as to look, is also to create, or to when you come into what you're referring to, John, as your encounter with the archive, which is very messy, unpredictable. What you're also doing is you're bringing to the surface, and you're narrativizing, and you're bringing context too. And it's something that maybe we might take for granted now, because some of the images that do end up in your films, or you did index, are now kind of floating through the internet, and we're just taking for granted that this has always been Blackness in the 70s in London, or this has always been what an Egyptian might have been like in 1956. We just presume it now, but it is exhumed. In fact, it's something that had to be kind of gone to. So I'm interested in that process then that you keep referring to, of simultaneously creating the inventory as well as kind of well, creating what you need in essence. And how do you do that? How do you do that without getting frightened, without getting overwhelmed, without yourself starting to feel like that entropy is overwhelming, and that the whole sort of, even the institutions that are supposed to kind of memorialize are failing you? Because you're supposed to just get there and get the stuff and make the film, and now you have to do all this other work. It's a general question.
No, that's a nice one. Do you mind if I have a go, Jihan?
Go.
I'm ready to go. I mean, I love phrases. I love hearing other people come up with phrases that allows them to make sense of things. And, you know, you just use one that is one of my favorites, you know. You said exhume, you know. I love the sense of exhumation that one brings to these gestures, which are, after all, part of our obligations to the dead, you know. Because the real problem I found is not a problem of the traditional dyad of absence presence, you know. There's an absence of Black images, so what you do is you go in there and you find them, and then you give it a presence. If it was that simple, things would be a lot easier. In fact, what we started to find was that that there were images or categories in which a certain kind of Blackness was located, but they were categories and images which were locked into a dialectic, and that dialectic was a narrative of unbecoming. Right? So it's not simply that there weren't any Black images. There were, but those Black images, for instance, or Asian, call it what you will, were in categories that were about denying them a kind of humanity, to be liberal humanist about this for a moment, okay? And as Pervaiz said, you know, you would, for instance, if you wanted Black images, you didn't go to a category called Blackness, you went to something called color bar or the color problem, or, you know, in other words, all the images that were in most of the European archives at the time seemed to be caught up in a kind of social problem dialectic, right? Which had this weird kind of engagement with whiteness, because a lot of it was about telling you something about a besieged whiteness, or the unsullied whiteness which will be threatened by this. It was all, you know, really caught up in this narrative of pathologizing one set in order to make whole, make cleaner, make clearer another group, you know. So you were immediately plunged into this aesthetic and ethical battle with the very thing that you say you were turning to save you in the first place. You know, you start asking it questions. And those questions are to do with relocation, the ethic of relocating, you know, the ethic of decloaking, you know, the precarious, etc., etc. You know, it becomes a fight in itself in a space which is not neutral, right? The archive vault, both metaphorically and physically, is not a neutral space. There are caretakers, and they are either persons or narratives or institutions. You know? And when you say you want to do this, you take them on, either because you can afford to, or because you have to, or because there are things in it that you have to find a path to get to, you know. And none of this is without struggle, has to be said. Yeah, so I don't want to give the impression that, you know, which is really what's somehow taken hold in many, many initiatives at the moment, which is the idea that there is something called the archive, which is there, that you go to, and you find things in it that affirms narratives. When you get to those places called the archive, what you find are unproblematic existences, right, of unproblematic characters and narratives. Not true at all, in fact.
Actually, I wanted to get to Palesa's, the way I love the way you said, you know, well, you're adding a chore where you're supposed to, you know, just get on with it. But actually, it's the exact opposite. When you start, when at least most of the countries I've worked in, and even my country, the concept of the archive and going towards it, you're already in battle gear. I mean, like, yeah, you know that you're going to have problems. Are you ready or are you not? So it's not like you go. I remember the first time I went to NARA in the US. I was like, I didn't know what to do with myself. My God, I can just say what I want, and they give me a little card, and I go get it. Is that how it works? I mean, traditionally, this isn't how it works. How it works is that you come into it knowing that if you're going to find something, you're going to fight for it. And most probably, if you find stuff that's being hidden, and then you also, I'd like to underline that a lot of the political battles internally go through the archive. So, for example, when Sadat comes to power, what he does is that he gets rid of a lot of the archive. So what you find in the official archive are only the moments that everyone has seen before, which is Nasser and the crowds cheering. So anything else that happened is unfindable. But one of the things I found very interesting is that at a certain period, they'd burn the archives, the image archives, but they'd forget to burn the audio DAT. You know, they had audio. So I'd find all this audio that obviously came with images at some point. So that's another layer of archive, the audio, because it tells stories that you'll never find in images. And for example, also Radio Cairo, which by the way had 18 languages as part of this Pan-African concept, you find that archive, but you find no history to put this in context. And so just, I mean, what I just wanted in Palesa is that, no, you don't take for granted that this is something you're going to find and you're going to use. You go in there knowing that the risk of spending sometimes years could be a complete futile adventure in terms of the film you're trying to make right now. But it's not a futile adventure in terms of the personal level. And I think, I mean, I'm a newcomer to the art world, if that phrase makes any sense. So like, I don't know, 2000 and something. But in a way, I came to it as a bit of a liberator, because there's certain kinds of archives that I have grappled with, that there's a whole narrative that I have, but I can't put into a film because. So when we start off about the obstacles and challenges, another layer of obstacles and challenges is what is it we are allowed to do in terms of format. Because if you're doing a TV film, it's not about the challenges of what I can do and what the archive does. It's what are the parameters that you are allowed to use them in. Like, of course, when you started a bit earlier on, the challenges in terms of logistics were slightly less. Release forms, the trail of rights, all these things were slightly less. Now, the minute you use an image, it's like you have to climb the mountain. It feels like the Rock of Sisyphus, like, oh my God. And like, whose images is this? Like something like Lumumba, the famous image where they put it exists in 7 archives. It doesn't belong to anyone. Yet depending on where you took it from, you then have to forget the money. It's like the whole system that you have to go through. And I think these challenges is part of, I'm currently the Director General of an institution called DocsBox, and we came up with this manifesto that that we spent 3 years working on, called Liberate the Image. Liberate it, because we need to use these images, and we need images, and archive images are there for us to interact with them and to live with them and to reinterpret them. They're useful in terms of what we are and what we will become also. Put by institutions, yes, claiming intellectual property, but how come intellectual property? Why is this archive sitting in the British National Archive in the first place? Which brings us to the whole question of restitution and colonial archives, which opens a whole other Pandora's box. We haven't even dealt with the other one to start dealing with this one,
Is that our segue?
It is indeed. And it's a really beautiful one. I think, Jihan, you're bringing up many things, and I think a lot of them are quite emotional and quite evocative. I can feel the kind of the emotion in what you're saying, and I think please kind of for you, John and Jihan, maybe do dive in, because I can sense that there's a lot in the questions of ownership and in the questions of access. And I think even the way that I'm saying it is kind of bringing it into very sort of banal language. But there's actually a lot that we're getting at here. And I'd like you both to maybe dive in and expand.
I mean, it's so much of what Jihan has been talking about in the last 10 minutes is so suggestive of all of our encounters with the archival, especially when she spoke about going to NARA, which is the American Library of Congress sort of media division. Anyone who wants to understand anything about overdevelopment and underdevelopment needs to just pay a visit to that library. The thing which I've been obsessed by, and that's in a way tied up to the colonial archive, is the many complex ways in which the archival occupies this mimetic relation to, its national narrative or its national host, post-national host, even, if you like. So, for instance, if the lives of people in Ghana go through a period of maximum precarity, then you could guarantee that this precariousness will also characterize the archival, how it's preserved or not. And one of the only times that I've not been, usually I'm kind of angry about archives, but there was only one time when I was so distraught that I just sat down and cried because I didn't know what else to do. And this was in Ghana about 15 years ago, when it became clear that the Ghanaian archive had absolutely mirrored, all the narratives of underdevelopment that one would find in a Walter Rodney book or Samir Amin book. I mean, absolutely mirrored it, because there were two strands of material. If you were a filmmaker in Ghana between 50, then the Gold Coast, to the late 90s, and you shot anything beyond a certain date, if you shot material in color, it was sent to Europe, to Britain, to be developed and processed and all that. And if it was black and white, it was done in Ghana. Right? This was the black and white material, in other words, was a sort of Pan-African incrumentalist gesture, right, of autonomy and self-sufficiency. All the narratives that one finds absolutely central to the Pan-African discourse, where the organizing tropes and motifs for why black and white archives existed in West Africa. And when I got there finally to try and access it, much of it had been locked into a room. And you've got to realize this was, this is West Africa, it's hot. Right. Much of it had been locked in a room with no air conditioning, and this is nitrate stock a lot of the time. So some of it, quite a bit of it had gone up in flames, right? Now, it would be great to mount my high horse and talk about archives and, how dare the Ghanaians do this archive. The problem was that the archival existed, in, as I said, in this completely mimetic relation. It absolutely mirrored the hardships in the society at large. Nobody had air conditioning, never mind film. Most people didn't have power. It went off for half a day. And generators were only there for embassies and NGOs, big NGOs. Now, if you wanted a complete contrast to this, you flew to London that evening, and in the morning you could walk into Technicolor, right? Pristine. And in the vault, there was the color material shot by Ghanaians. Pristine, clean, kept. As long as you paid for it, it was there. So it is important for us to say that this is also the case. Now, the problem here is that much of that archive exists in this anti-colonial move that many of these countries made. And to speak about the colonial archive is just too big. So I'm going to park that for a minute and defer to Jihan if you wanted to say anything to that.
No, I think you said shot by Ghanaians. And I think just to broaden this a bit, there's a huge difference between former British colonies and former French colonies, because the former French colonies between 1934 and 1960, you had something called the Laval Decree. And the Laval Decree forbid natives to have anything to do with filming, technical assistance, anything to do with the image. And so up until 1960, there is nothing shot by, except countries like Egypt, well, we know it starts way back and it's different. But the whole of French former colonies, there are no images shot through the local gaze. Even if they're rotting, it just doesn't exist because it was forbidden. And I think this is very important when we talk about colonial archive, because yes, it's very precious. We cannot take it out of the reality of of our history, because as much as we want to decolonize the gaze, at the same time, we did live through colonialism. That's something we have to deal with. It's part of our history. We can't just say, oh, what were we like before? This did happen. And so I think the colonial archive is really fascinating because on the one hand, and it's somehow easier in the French countries because you know that all of this is shot by someone else through that gaze, whereas the images from former British colonies, you're not quite sure, is this from here, is this from there? And the analysis of the image. So, for example, a Sudanese archive, a huge Sudanese archive from the 40s was just digitized, actually probably one of the first African filmmaker, Jadallah Jabara. And I was like, before he died, I was working with him sometimes, and then with his daughter, who finally managed to digitize the archive, which obviously I hadn't seen because we couldn't see it. And then I start watching some of the images, and I felt terribly uncomfortable, because I know it's shot by him, but everything in it comes from an era where the translation is not particularly what we expect, because it wasn't that period. So our relationship and our, the generations before us shifts, and I'll underline what John was saying, mimicking where we're at. This comes through the image. But then the question of access, you said ownership and access. Both of them are huge issues, because ownership, what are we talking about ownership? I mean, what is it? Is it about who shot it? Who bought the celluloid? Who's in it? Like, who owns it? I do not want to get into these debates. Why? Because we have a right to that footage, no matter what the trail of rights are. You want to call it accessibility, you want to call it whatever it is, but we have a right to be part, use, and if ownership is another methodology of monetization, I'm really not interested in that debate. I know some people are. I know that there are full archives being found, and if it's just another format of, do we recreate another form of coloniality into these archives, no matter where it's coming from? That's a whole issue that I don't particularly want to get into. But accessibility, I'm sorry, I have a right to map where these archives are. I have a right to use them, and have a right to use them, I'm not saying for free, because if we start arguing about using archive for free, then the whole issue of preservation comes up.
Right. Yeah.
Archives do cost money. And when I first started working with archive, we had to just pay transfer fees and preservation. So a minute of archive costs you between most expensive $100, $150. Okay, now maybe it's more expensive, $300. Fine, maybe they should be paid. But don't come ask me for 4,000 or 5,000 euros a minute. For whom? Why? It's this process that stops us and stops the South from questioning, engaging with its own archive, because it's not just about using it. I need to question it too. You know?
Yeah. Jihan, I love how you are bottom line. Hey, we're with you. Are you with us? I love how you are you're bringing us to the bottom line as far as there's just some questions that don't need to be asked, and so we don't have to speculate around them. And I think a lot of what you're saying is that's squaring the circle, like you said, John. That's the bottom line. Like we have a right to it, and we should, like, and as you've said, there's a war to be fought, I suppose, when it comes to that question. I wanted to take us into who is listening to us on YouTube or watching us on YouTube, and to maybe read through a comment that has been shared. It might not necessarily keep us in this conversation, in this part of the conversation, but I think it'll help kind of broaden this question uses the phrase contested heritage. And I'll read the whole question for everyone. This is from Andile, who says, she I think she has some relationship with the Otolith group. Yeah, that's awesome. Yes. Cool.
And we both know her very well. She's
awesome.
The second half of the Otolith group.
Hey,
or the first half of the Otolith group.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you so much, Andile. So she's written the UK government has passed a bill to outlaw critical race theory and anti-capitalist teaching in schools. And this has been discussed in a recent 3-hour debate on critical race theory in Parliament. And Oliver Dowden from the DCMs recently told all major institutions that they have to take an arm's length approach to activism or politics. This is happening in the States as well. This is they kind of excising this kind of material from the curriculum, and this was in a letter based on contested heritage and the tearing down of monuments. I see. These bills require more complex ways of rethinking, she says, narrative, as we recently discussed in an interview she had with you, John, for Freeze. If there's ever a time for thinking how to deal with this as the unthought, it is now. I think maybe this question brings us to something that is about the present moment. And Jihan, you said you run an institution that is very much concerned with access, but also here's the question of how the work that you have been involved in, the work that other filmmakers are involved in, or other artists or teachers are involved in, how it sits with the greater questions of whose story is being told and whose history is being taught, etc. The war continues, it seems.
I would continue to. It's a very, very good set of observations / questions from Anthony, and I would address it by saying that we need to, even in what appears to be difficult times, we need to continue this dialogue on the decolonial. We need to continue this dialogue on relocating remains. I don't take terribly seriously what the present Tory Conservative government is saying, but I know why they're saying it, and the reasons why they're saying it needs to be addressed. Right? And it does have something to do with the colonial, right? Because the colonial project, as I understood it and still continue to understand it, was not simply about dominating peoples or appropriating their relics and so on. It was a total environmental project, right, in which the question of husbanding, of mastery were absolutely central. And the way in which it sold itself was always through this language of benevolence or disinterestedness. You know, oh, this is not about us being superior and you being inferior. We're just doing this because it would help you. You know, if we control this line, then we can get rid of the tsetse fly, and then you wouldn't get diseases. Blah 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 blah. You know, in other words, there was always this attempt to make a gulf between the so-called ethical and political, or the ethical and the legal, the political and the practical and the pragmatic. And this is, in a way, what the current Tories are trying to get us back to. You know, to say, well, there's something called education, right? And that education shouldn't be, quote unquote, tainted by, you know, you taking us into territories that are not about education. So let's just go back to this so-called education that's non-tainted. A couple of months ago, a group of young people in the city of Bristol, in England, tore down a statue of a slave trader and dumped him, the statue that is, into the Bristol Sea. Most people in positions of power, especially on the right, then dumped on these kids from great heights. Oh, this is terrible, it's illegal, it's vandalism. Right now, what we're talking about here is a trafficker, right? A serial trafficker, rapist, murderer, mass murderer. That's who we're talking about here, not just anyone. So it's a bit like having a statue to Nielsen or any of these major serial killers in America sitting in the middle of a community, right? In which you say to people, don't do anything about that, because to do anything about that is illegal. I want to return to something before the legal. And I think that's what these actions, whether it's about teaching critical history, race theory, or I want to return to the importance of the ethical. Never mind the moral, just the ethical. And that for me precedes and comes before the legal. Okay, so what I would like to know is what a society is doing, having in its midst effigies of human traffickers, mass murderers, serial rapists, that it protects under this garb of the legal. This is really the ethical problem we have with many of the colonial narratives.
But if you'll allow me, John, you're completely, this question about the legal and how the legal is, as you were saying, the ethical and the legal, that's where the critical question lies. Because if we take that back to the archive, I was just having a Zoom call with a panel with the June Giovanni archive, and copyright, for example. Fine, you can keep us running around in circles around copyright, this and that, but copyright only started in the 1800s. And the Berne Convention changed it, or the copyright laws, all the way up to 1971. So if anybody wants to do anything about copyright, and if the ethical supersedes the legal, not only supersedes, just addresses the legal, then we wouldn't have a problem. The real question is, are you willing? And that's where the whole question of decolonizing, now it's this fancy word that everybody loves using, and which is like the headline of everything we see, but it's being voided of its content. Because if you really want to decolonize, start by the legal frameworks, because that is what is implementing the perpetuation of colonial infrastructures.
But the legal cannot be a guarantor of impunity, you know, for certain narratives or certain institutions. Look, you know, unless, you know, 1956, had Rosa Parks not said, okay, I challenge this law with a slightly higher ethical ideal, which is that as a human being, I am allowed to sit here, right? Occasionally, the legal has to be hijacked in order to point out that there are elements in it that are not, you know, and we have that problem at the moment. There's the cloak of impunity that many institutions of government in this country, but across the world, where there are colonial historical traces, fragments, and so on. People want the cover of impunity placed as a cloak on institutions, on monuments, etc., etc. And I want us to dispute that, not because I don't respect the law or because I don't think that there are instances where we have to insist on it, but there are clearly moments when it is being used to deprive us of voices and agency in spaces. And when it comes to what we do about the historical, that is certainly one of the means by which this current government here, you know, you hear it from Trump and these people all the time. They go, oh, well, this is our history. No, well, no, it is our history.
It is our history.
Not just yours, it's our history, you know? Yeah. Because, you know, especially with these films, when you go to it, as we had this conversation the first time I was here, you know, people assume that there's something called the cinema, which is on one side, that's all clean and nice, and, you know, it's John Wayne and all that stuff. And then there's something called the ethnographic film, which is sort of a supplement over there somewhere. Not true at all, right? In fact, most national archives have much more of the so-called ethnographic than they do of anything else. And as you watch it, you realize that actually the rules by which much of what we call the cinematic emerged is in those spaces, right? Yeah. In the other spaces. That's where, you know, which is why the bulk of any cinematic archive is in fact of ethnographic stuff, not John Wayne, you know, or Buster Keaton. That's not the majority. The majority of stuff is the medical doctors, the missionaries, the theological societies who, you know, film Bantu life and Tossers life and Gar lives and costumes and ritual. That's the bulk, right? That is the majority of the moving image on the planet, right? So the idea that somehow there's something called the colonial, which is about whiteness and therefore not about us, is absolutely the false dichotomy in this instance. You know, we are all central at the table at this formation of this thing. We are absolutely central. We are the subject of this thing. So if we don't have a voice in how it is put dismantled or reassembled, if we don't have a voice, nobody does.
Pervaiz, you had a question.
I think it came out of what Jihan and John were both saying, and it's to John, but it's also about what Jihan was saying in terms of the process. Because I've heard you speaking before that, you know, there's obviously in a way that your own work has developed, yes, and an engagement with going through the archive, not just the moving image archive, the paper-based archives, the sonic archives, yes, the paintings, yes, the process. I know you've said at times there was a luxury in the past when you were part of a collective. You spent a lot of time going through the process, yes, and engaging with those different materials. And because obviously we're looking at the way that archives aren't just the moving image. The moving image is one aspect of it. And if you could just elaborate on that. And I know both of you probably have things just on that area, please.
Jihan, you can have a go at that, sure.
Well, about 10 minutes left. I think the moving image is obviously only one aspect of it, but it's a very powerful one. Paper, documents are another passion, and ironically, I got a bit hooked on first editions of newspapers, because there's something about the first edition. I don't know if it happens everywhere in the world, but the newspapers come out like past midnight, and the fresh time someone, oh, no, don't print this. The edition you actually find in the morning doesn't have the same news. And so I spent a lot of time trying to find the first and second edition of the same newspaper. And you'd be surprised to see that. I guess, I mean, it just brings me back to, I'm just kind of obsessed by deconstructing how we are taken into a mythology of thinking that the event and this is what happened, and then you find the same newspaper on the same day, edition 1 and edition 2. What happened isn't really what happened. So I collect a lot of newspapers, but you need space for that, by the way. And my archives are all over the place. So newspapers and sound. Sound, I think, is one of, for me, that I'm paying more attention to. But it started with finding these DAT tapes of burnt images, and then you suddenly realize that we always look at sound as secondary when you're looking for the moving image, but actually sound gives a complete different narrative. The way the image tells you a different story through body language, even if the words are coming out. The sound, the soundscapes, where things were happening, how they were happening, the bells chiming in the background. I mean, and I think sound archives for me, at the moment at least, are a complete different space of creativity, but also are somehow allowing me a bit more freedom. Alongside, I mean, obviously when I talk, it's not, you don't kind of leave one practice and go to another. And I always, it's been a personal battle, because I started as a photographer. Like my first job ever, and to move from a photographer to be a journalist took forever, because people always wanted to keep you, that's what you do, that's what you can do. And that's what you do. Then you're a writer. And to go from a writer to documentary, and like each and every one, people try to keep you in that niche, because that's what you only. And I think what's fascinating for me is that each and every one comes with its own archive and with its own process of accumulation. Because when I was a photographer, my interest was primarily in stills photography. So the amount of glass plates I have was out of a practice, a process that came out of that practice. But you don't kind of leave it behind. It's part of, you take all these things along with you. And I think when you get to a certain point, there are very few moments when all these practices come together with their archives, with their processes, and they're intertwined. You don't leave anything behind. I don't know for you, John. You don't leave things behind. You hope to. You keep saying, okay, let me get rid of this. It's overwhelming. But you don't.
I mean, we've just moved the studio, and you know, like very sadly again, the bulk of stuff that we're bringing to the space takes up more room than is left for us to work in. So something's got to give. Not sure how we're going to manage that. We've already got 2 spaces that are packed with stuff from the Black Audio period that I worked in. So attics that are packed, you know, so we're going to have to work something out. I mean, the reasons for why all that material is there is, yes, as Pervaiz said, you know, it's when you look at these hundreds, and then literally they're 200 boxes. Some have rushes of 16mm and 35 film that needs to be kept in a very needs to be kept in a very specific kind of way. So, you know, we're trying to continue to build spaces that are cooler for them. We've got newspaper cutouts from the 40s, the 50s, the 1890s that also needs to be stored in a very particular way. Reel-to-reel tapes with sound, you know. In a way, our library of material pretty much mirrors how we've worked, you know, and how I continue to work, which is to call on an array of archival resources, which are then kind of lined up in some sort of relation of affinity to each other. And what I have found, which is really where most of the work originates, is exactly what Jihan was referring to, the slippage, the gap, the gulf between things, right. You know, even first and second editions. You know. And it's in that space of what the Marxists used to call relative autonomy that the work actually starts, because it's those gaps that are the suggestive gaps. Either for constructing new fictions, or, you know, alternative historiographies, or counter cartographies, or, you know, narratives of becoming whatever. You know, it starts in the assumption that there are spaces of entropy, as you used before, in which a kind of emergency is at work, an emergency of possible disappearance, but also of reappearance and appearance. You know? And I take those gaps seriously. I try and find mechanisms for activating those gaps, activating the potentials of those gaps, to see what they might speak had they been, you know, filled. You know, so sometimes it's just voices. I mean, one of the things I loved about making Last Angel of history, for instance, the project we did on Afrofuturism in the 90s, was just hearing people speak. You know, you go around the world, you know, Detroit, New York, LA, London, Birmingham, interviewing people, and, you know, you get this cacophony, and you realize the ways in which the archive presents itself in our lives.
Yeah.
The memorial routes by which it sort of maps itself onto our psyches is very, very different. So people have lived, you know, you're talking about a group of young men of color, Black men, who've grown up pretty much roughly in the same time. And yet their takes on things are completely different. Yeah. What Goldie has to say about sound is really different from what DJ Spooky has to say, which is really different from Derek May, which is really different from Kojo Eshin. I mean, you know, and yet, you know, the paradox is they've grown up in that. This is what the archive is. This is the presence of the archive.
What's interesting in what you've both said and in your work, I think, respectively, I think there's a lot to be said about your work. And I think bringing the two of you together, there's just simply not enough time. There's simply not enough time, because you come at this thing from different places, but it seems like you've converged and then crossed. It's just, I actually had a lot more, I think, to ask about actually your actual practice. And I'm glad this is kind of where we're arriving to, especially because we've run out of time.
No.
It's simply deplorable. But the thing that is interesting to me is when I think of both your work and my encounter with it, and how those interviews that you do and the way that you do explain what you're calling alignments, or the way you line things up, both of you, both gives me meaning, narrative, context, etc. But it also gives me a new set of, it gives new archive. The interviews you do create are new archive. So I see this thing that you're describing as a body just growing, and it's infinite, and it's kind of our remembering it and putting it together and taking it apart, and does it speak, does it not speak? What is really clear is that it's an ever-growing thing, and that's what's truly exciting about this. And what I've appreciated is that we've got to see a little bit how the both of you approach that body, because it's a very complex thing, and it can be overwhelming. But also how you love it, and what you're trying to do, what you believe you're doing. I think that's been a blessing. It's been a gift. We have to end this conversation. I can't believe that.
I'm sorry, but thank you very much. Hey, I'm sorry to have to draw it to a close. It's just that we've got other panels that we have to get on with. Appreciate your being there, John and Jihan and Palesa. Yes, it's like an unfinished conversation, as we know. That yes, we'll continue.
It's been an unfinished conversation for a long time.
Bye, everyone.
Okay.
Real pleasure. Take care.